I'm Scott Allen Miller, and on today's special edition of the vlog, I'm going to be answering the question that people have asked and I knew was coming, and that is to explain the real estate market in Nicaragua, because we talked about house prices in a recent episode, but the actual real estate market is what we actually have to talk about. Houses are easy, right? They start cheap, they get expensive, same as anywhere, right? Yeah, they're cheaper here, and really expensive isn't as expensive as other places, but that doesn't really give you a good picture of what's happening here. Nicaragua is really, really unique and interesting, and it makes real estate extremely hard. The hardest place I know in the world where it's a market problem and not a legal one. The legalities of buying a house, selling a house here in Nicaragua are actually really good. It's got a very strong legal system, a very straightforward civil law code, and yeah, there's some gotchas. Of course, you want to have attorneys involved and people who know what they're doing, but in general, buying and selling here is really straightforward and relatively simple. It's not super fast because they tend to do some things in paper and triplicate and gets filed a lot of places, and that takes some time. Those are minor details. In general, it's a very simple market to buy and sell. What's difficult is finding a house and figuring out what its price is, what you're going to be able to get it for, how long it's going to take to get it, and how much you should be paying for it. Now, number one, I want to explain the key thing that makes Nicaragua special, and that is that it is a incredibly varied market on a locality basis with no comps. It is a non-comp or non-commodity market. Now, what do I mean by that? In most places, the United States, Canada, even Bolivia, places where I deal with questions of real estate, we tend to understand real estate as a commodity. It's an investment vehicle, and it is generally a commodity. So when you have a commodity, you have comps or comparables. So if you're going to buy a house in the US or Canada for sure, and in nearly any market you can think of, you can get a really good guide as to how much something should cost by looking at its square footage, looking at its neighborhood, looking at what has bought and sold, been purchased and sold within a reasonable time frame, the last 6 months, 2 years, or whatever. Account for a small amount of market shift. Maybe houses have generally gone up by 0.5%, add a few $100s to accommodate for that, and you have a good idea of what you should be asking for a house and a good idea of what someone's likely to be willing to pay for it. Comps are a really important part of what a real estate agent does for you in those markets. So that's the first thing. All the markets that people come from to purchase in Nicaragua are used to comps. There are no comps here. We'll explain that, but there aren't any. Don't try to come up with reasons why there should be, why you think there will be. There are not. Period. End of story. They do not exist. The concept makes no sense here. We'll get into it. But do not try to convince yourself that somebody is going to be able to produce comps for you and that we're crazy, the people who live here who don't have any. We're not crazy. We've all done the research. We know why it doesn't exist. You can't change that just by wanting it to exist. But everyone thinks that by wishing it into existence, it'll happen. It won't. The second thing is that there is no real estate market per se. Now, this is really important. If you're coming from the United States or Canada, or again, most countries, there tends to be a strong real estate market, an actual formal market. In the United States, which is where I'm from, I'm going to use as an example, buyers and sellers, agents in real estate are a strictly regulated activity. If you want to be a buyer's agent, you have to follow certain guidelines, and you must represent the buyer. You cannot be the seller's agent. If you're a seller's agent, you must follow strict guidelines and represent the seller. You cannot represent the buyer, and so forth. You have very, very strong conflict of interest laws that dictate how you can work. This does not exist in Nicaragua. For the same reason we don't have comps, it doesn't make any sense to have real estate agents and people who do that work, so there's no framework for that. Those two things are the key facts that determine everything about the Nicaraguan market. Okay, let's start talking about comps. In any given neighborhood, for example, the one I'm standing in right now, you may be able to see houses behind me. There'll be similar houses in front of me. I can turn all around and show you lots of houses that from the outside look relatively similar. You might think, coming from the United States, that you could look at the prices on these houses and determine from their purchase prices in the past what they're going to cost today. There's a lot of flaws to this theory. First, Location matters a lot in Nicaragua. The difference in the value between the house on the corner and the house in the middle of the street may be significant based on its location. This is true in the United States too, but not to the degree it is in Nicaragua. Back where I live on the beach, the difference between even just a couple doors down the road could triple the value of the land the house sits on, let alone the value of the house itself. So it's very important to understand that location has so much more importance here on average than in another country. Now, of course, we can say location, 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 that is a thing, it matters everywhere. Of course, location matters in the United States. Yes, it does. But in the United States, location is generally considered in a large scale. Now, if you're building a gas station or a McDonald's or a Starbucks, location may be just down to a few meters. But when you're talking about normal houses and comps, you're talking about neighborhoods. Everything's developments. And so you say, well, this development, which is a few hundred houses, that's one location, and the one next to it is a slight variation on that location. Here in Nicaragua, for example, where we are on the beach, the difference between our place and just 3 doors down could be orders of magnitude difference in price. You may expect the land in one spot to be $50,000 and in the next spot to be $2,000 or $3,000 because its access to the beach, its view, its weather, whatever, can be so dramatically different in such a small area. And of course that can be true in other countries, but here the chances that it's going to be true are very high. It is normal. And so anywhere you go, the location matters significantly. So you can't just say, well, the house next to me was worth this much, therefore mine should be similar based on its location, or at least the land that your house sits on. If you look only at the land, yes, it does have some amount of information that you can gain from that, but far less than you would expect, and you have to accept that it just isn't going to tell you as much as you would hope. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that in any given area, for example, the houses behind me or beside me here, they can vary to a degree you're not expecting from what you would get in the United States. Normally in the United States, if you have 2 houses in it or 3 or 4 houses in a row, they're gonna be built very similar to each other. And they're not even connected in the United States, right? They're always gonna be disconnected, or almost always. But their construction time, their construction materials, their size, all those things are likely to be extremely similar, and they will share a lot of things. Here, from the outside, it would be easy to say these places must be nearly identical inside. They seem to share an outside wall and a roof line. They must be the same inside, and that is anything but true. You could be looking at houses that are just a few hundred square feet, or in some cases, not even a house. It may look like a house, but when you open the outside door, you find out it's nothing but a shell and an open garden inside. That's actually a reasonable thing to find, or just an open garage space. Some of these things that look like houses may have a little bit larger door. You open the door, it's just an open air garage parking lot. That's obviously not worth very much money. It's just the land and access that you're buying. There's no house at all. The house next to it might be 500 or 800 square feet with a garden and some outside space. The one next to that could easily be 4,000 square feet completely inside. You can't tell what is and isn't a mansion from what is or isn't an open parking lot. That means the potential variation within a neighborhood can be extremely high, but more importantly, it is very high. In the blocks that I'm standing in, almost all of those things exist on every block. And from the outside, you don't know which it is. In fact, if I go down just 2 blocks this way, one of the houses that you're most sure is a completely decrepit shell is actually a mansion. They just leave it that way because they don't want people, I guess, I'm hypothesizing, they don't want people to be, you know, targeting them because it's a really large, beautiful mansion inside, so they keep it looking like it's absolutely nothing. It's a good strategy, but it's mixed into the neighborhood. You just never know what you're going to find. And it's one of the reasons that walking through Nicaragua can be really interesting because of the open outdoors culture where windows and doors are often left open. There's a lot of times you will get glimpses into houses and you will see unbelievable variation all the time on any given walk, and it's just amazing what you'll find nestled next to each other. So the idea that you have very similar neighbors, like in the United States or Canada, really doesn't exist here. There's some amount of that, but very, very little. So that's going to affect you a lot as you try to determine what a comp might need to be. Also affecting the concept of comps is that houses do not sell very often here. This is a colonial country, so a lot of the houses have been passed down for generations. Getting information on what a house has sold for in the past could be nearly impossible. In fact, some of them have never sold. Some are passed down through inheritances, some are traded for business deals. They're simply not the kind of buying and selling market that you expect from other countries, and so because of that, you often don't have the number of transactions necessary to produce comps, even if you had a situation where comps were plausible. That makes it so much worse. So even it's a small country. There's about 6 million people, 6.5 million in the population. That means the entire country only has a population smaller than a major US city. Say Dallas, Philadelphia, or Houston. All of those are significantly larger metro areas than the entire Nicaraguan country. So any given region within the country is extremely small. You take into account the differences in land, the differences between the buildings, the differences between the neighborhoods, which are very close to each other, sometimes only a few blocks in size, differences in municipal resources to those, which again, very different from neighborhood to neighborhood, and then take into account that you could be looking at neighborhoods where only 1 or 2 houses have sold in the last several years. There's nothing for you to go on as far as comps. And the final thing, comps, the prices of houses, the information necessary for comps, even taking all that into account, assuming that they're, well, we're willing to live with all these things, we're going to use intelligent computer projection models to take this information and still try to derive something from it. Okay, in theory, maybe you could do that if you knew enough about a house, you had all of its square footage, you had all of its build qualities and how old it is, because houses vary by hundreds of years here commonly. You'll find a brand new construction directly next door to a house that's over 200 years old, looking the same from the outside, touching walls. If you had all that, you were still left with one really critical fact, and that is that the cost, the deals of sold houses are not registered publicly, or they are, but they are not public information. You do not have the ability to go collect the information from your neighbors and find out what their houses cost when they bought them. So even if a house did sell, you don't have the right to that information. Of course, you could go ask them, and then you're trusting all the parties involved to disclose information that generally they don't want to disclose to anyone, especially because the cost of a house affects its taxes. So a lot of times you're going to find people selling parts of the land as a real estate deal and then selling parts of it as something else to reduce their tax burden. So they can't even disclose how much is being transferred because it's being semi-falsified to the government or used and manipulated in interesting ways. Maybe that's okay, but it doesn't make for a real estate transaction that can be used in any kind of meaningful way by you as a third party. So now that we know that comps aren't possible, now we have to tackle the issue of real estate agents. Remember, there are no such thing as official real estate agents in the country, just people who call themselves that. This leads to a problem because there are expectations of real estate agents in the United States and other markets that we bring with us simply from hearing the name. We assume that they have knowledge of the market. We assume that they have access to a multiple listing service or some type of resource that allows them to look up information on available homes and their performance in the past. And we assume that they have comps in order to do calculations to tell us something about what we should be paying for the house. We also then assume a skill set in being able to negotiate and getting us a good deal on the house because they work in our interest. Every one of these things is false in Nicaragua. So let's tackle these. There is no multiple listing service. This is key. There is no place for these real estate agents or so-called real estate agents to go and get information about all the houses that are available, even in their own town, let alone across the country. That's also important because things are so spread out in Nicaragua, and generally when people are shopping for real estate here, they're looking over a wide area, not in a really small area. So even if you found a real estate agent who knew a local area, they may not be very useful because you're probably going to be looking at options over an area they do not have the ability to cover, even if they wanted to. But the lack of multiple listing service is unbelievable in how it affects everything. There's no mechanisms to change that. Houses are generally listed by word of mouth. They simply have "Se Vende" written on the side of the building, and if you're lucky, maybe they'll be posted on Facebook or something like that. But those are basically the only mechanisms that are used. If you're not using one of those mechanisms to find available houses, you're not really looking. But the problem is that those resources are just as easily available to you as a non-real estate agent, and possibly more so than it is to a real estate agent or someone posing as one. If you're interested in a neighborhood, say this one, I can simply walk down the street and see what's for sale. I can also pop in at the door and ask. If there's a house I'm really interested in, I can just say, "Are you interested in selling this house?" That sounds ridiculous. That's how I bought my house. So that kind of thing is real. People are not putting up the houses are for sale that they would like to sell because the market's bad. Now that's just a current thing that will change normally, but that is very effective, that you can simply walk by and ask people if they want to sell you their house, and they might want to. Real estate agents aren't going to do anything there that you can't do, and they won't do it as effectively as you can. Sure, you could hire someone to do it remotely for you. That could be a benefit, but that would be a benefit to someone who isn't officially listing themselves as a real estate agent as well. Because there's no multiple listing service, because there's no regulations, there is no need for a real estate agent to actually have any skills or knowledge, any access to resources, and more importantly, there's nothing that says they have to act in your interest. Sure, you could have them write a contract that says they have to act in your interest. Yes, that may or may not hold water in court. You better hope you have a really good lawyer and a really good contract and a really good knowledge of the market, because otherwise you are putting a person into a place that, as far as Nicaragua is concerned, you have no business doing. This is foolish and reckless and caveat emptor. Why the heck are you hiring an untrusted third party who is in no way trained, knowledgeable, have access to resources, or in any way supposed to act in your interest, and expecting them to act in your interest while you give them the power to do anything they want? They can negotiate directly with the sellers. They can buy the house out from under you and sell it to you at any price. They can change the quotes you're receiving from every person to make it look like they're doing all kinds of work that they're not. It's unbelievable just how much structure happens in the United States and other countries to make sure that real estate agents act ethically, because everything in the system otherwise is putting an immense amount of trust into them that they could take advantage of, and the amount of money that's often involved is so high, it's very difficult for someone not to take advantage of it. So you have to be really, really careful. This is the #1 mechanism for scamming foreigners in this country, and it's almost entirely foreigners scamming foreigners, which of course means the government doesn't really care all that much. Of course, it's illegal, and they don't want illegal things happening. But as an overall mechanism, this is you were being foolish. What were you thinking? It's not really Nicaragua's problem if some foreigners let some other foreigners scam them in a really obvious con. So they're not doing a whole lot to look out for you. The courts will act as normal, but the police aren't exactly driving around looking for people posing as real estate agents to try to convince them not to act that way, because they don't actually know who's being good and who's being bad. They don't know who's breaching contracts or not. None of that's information the police have. So the only mechanism they have is when someone sues, and then the courts handle it, not the police, because it is completely legal to attempt to help someone with their real estate, and only you can determine if you were ripped off, and only after the fact. So the rule of thumb is you don't ever work with a real estate agent in Nicaragua. It just doesn't make sense. There's so much risk involved and so little potential benefit. The scam is so big that there's actually a large number of websites that list property here in Nicaragua and pretend to be a listing agent for that property. Everyone you talk to will have gone online and looked for property in Nicaragua. I am no exception. That's exactly what we did before we really got into our shopping process in looking for a home here. We looked online, we had a really good idea of prices, we had a really good idea of the market as far as inventory and all that. And when we actually started trying to buy remotely, we quickly learned that none of the houses we were actually looking at were truly for sale. In fact, some of them didn't exist. The listings, if the house actually existed, when someone, because we luckily had agents who were not real estate agents, we had employees on the ground who took teams and went to these houses, and they would take pictures and be like, yeah, what you're seeing on this website is heavily modified. Like, this is 10 years old, or this is, you know, these things have changed. They're saying this is a working business or a functional house. It doesn't even have a roof at this point. And then we would go through cycles of things like we would make an offer that was completely reasonable based on what they were asked, the list price. And then they would come back and say, oh no, we don't want that. We finally say, okay, we'll give you the list price. Oh no, we're actually not interested. We would want 50% more than the list price. And we said, really? So you're going through the process of doing all this sales. You won't take 50% more than the list price, and yet the place has been for sale for so long that it's actually falling down. You could never get into contact with the actual people. What we've found out over time, after doing this many times, is that the real estate agents were just taking old pictures of houses or pictures they had or ones they found online. They put up websites that list things so that people would look online, find them, come to the real estate agent office, and these are generally big US named offices. Not always, sometimes they're little independents, but often they're names you know from the United States. The companies in the US are involved in the scams at arm's length, right? They have no legal obligation to do anything here. They're just being, you know, a franchise is being purchased by someone. There's no oversight needed because there's no laws saying there needs to be. So big names that you think you can trust are the ones that have their names on these scams most of the time. They'll have these websites. You will find them by looking at this website. Wow, I love all these properties for list by this agent. I want to go learn more. Really quickly, you learn the agents cannot tell you about the property. They cannot sell you the property. Sometimes, if you're lucky, it's a property that is for sale, but there's no listing agent. The concept of listing agents doesn't exist here. So no one's going out and hiring a listing agent under normal circumstances. Once in a while, it does happen. You will find, especially foreigners, will be tricked into using a listing agent. And then you'll see, normally if you go to the building, you'll see the real estate company listed on the sign on the building. Then they're probably involved, but they're still not official. It's just someone they got to be a point of contact for selling the building so that the owner doesn't have to do it. Everything is different, right? So you end up going to these websites and being led astray, and then it's a bait and switch. Oh, the house you wanted, you can't afford it, even though the price it listed said you easily could. Or, oh, it just sold. Really? Nothing's sold. I've talked to the locals, nothing's selling. How did that one just sell? In fact, the locals can't even identify where this house is. Are you sure this is real? Things like that. There's always something that you can't quite verify unless you know people, and then something's obviously wrong. And then magically, well, we have this other house for you to look at. I've also had the experience here in Leon where you go to one of the offices and they have loads of things listed. This is just for apartments, not for houses. Look at our listing of all these things. It took days to get the office to even answer because they weren't even running the office. You finally get a hold of them. Oh yeah, we have lots of things to show you. Okay, we'd like to look at this list. Oh, we don't have any of those. Okay, what do you have? Well, we'll have to get back to you. And then it was, actually, we don't have any apartments. None. Not a single one. They had the entire thing, all the listings on the window, all the website, the people working the office. I think their goal is to get people to come in, start a conversation, and then they'll go look for apartments and hopefully find some so they can show you something. And that kind of makes sense. And if that's all they're doing, yes, it's a scam, but it's a minor one. But in this case, they had absolutely no ability to find apartments. We, however, were able to hop on Facebook, go ask some people, and found lots of apartments as options and at great deals. Half the price of what the real estate agency was trying to say the prices should be. Half the price. So there's a lot of different ways that you could get scammed. And the worst ones, of course, as I mentioned, you could have, and we have had this happen to us, we believe. We ended up stopping the process, luckily, but we had a real estate agent appear to attempt to purchase the property that we were trying to buy, manipulate the prices so we would never hear, so the seller would never hear what price we were offering, and we would never hear what price they finally agreed on, so that the real estate agent could buy it at a much lower price than we offered and sell it to us at a much higher price than the seller would have agreed to, and then pocket the difference. And that difference could easily have ended up being equal to the price of the property. So the degree to which these scams make money can be pretty significant. You could, especially with the low cost of living here, someone pulling these scams could make enough money to live for 5 or 10 years off of a single scam going well. And these scams are something they run day after day. So be aware, this is extremely common. This is not like some, oh, we've heard of it, it could, no, it's the average, right? Basically, almost anyone posing as a real estate agent is going to some degree, be working these kinds of scams. There's so much money involved, and there is just the way that it works, that's the way it's going to be. So because of that, be extremely cautious working with real estate agents. And I know there are some good ones out there. I have a friend of a friend in San Juan del Sur that I would trust that they're actively working as a real estate agent in your interest, but you still have to be aware they don't have an MLS, they don't have any of these tools. They simply drive around the country, do their best to collect information, they take videos, and they know the market pretty well. And I think, I've never tried to work with them, I think they're pretty upfront about that that's what they're doing, but you have to be aware that's what you're hiring someone to do. You're not hiring someone to be a real estate agent in the way we assume in the United States. The one listing that is truly real here in the country is when you find foreign developments that are selling pre-built things, and that's the only mechanism is to buy them from them. That's different, of course, because they're not a real estate site, right? They're just a selling part of their business site. So you're buying it directly from the seller in that case. But in general, just assume everything you know about real estate is untrue in Nicaragua. You have to get on the ground, you have to look at the houses, and you have to evaluate the prices as to what matters to you, not based on comps. It's just, that's how it works. It is the value to you. It is not a commodity market. You cannot buy a house with the intention of, well, I'm going to turn around and sell this and it'll definitely make more money because the market's coming up. I paid this for it, therefore it'll be worth at least 5% more in 5 years. No, you can't. You don't know if you're going to find another buyer like you. The value to another person will be completely different than the value to you. It is what it is. You have to look at this as a different market. It is not a stocks and bonds and real estate type of situation. It is a lot more like buying an antique where it's a one of a kind. Every house is a one of a kind. If you like it, see what you can get it for, know your prices, be willing to walk away. You can get great deals somewhere and you can overpay somewhere at all times, and you just have to know what different houses are going to be worth to you. The biggest thing you'll do, because you don't have a real estate agent, and even if you hire someone who's called a real estate agent, they are not in the way we mean it. So you have to have a lawyer. Now, it's good if you're in the United States or Canada to have a lawyer when you're doing real estate anyway, but here it is absolutely critical because your lawyer is going to be your key to everything. There's some complicated stuff with land here, and I'm not going to go into the legalities of it, but I have personally had to deal with multiple land transactions. Some involve, well, you're not actually buying the land, but you're buying the building on it. The land is a 99-year lease to an indigenous community, but here's how that lease works, and it's really well protected by law. Okay, so you have to understand, and that changes the value of the land. And then there's regular real estate transactions that are done through the local alcaldía, which is the mayor's office, but there are other transactions, such as reals, that happen through the Spanish crown and have been in place since colonial times. All of these have different laws that apply to them. They have different values that are associated with them, and you need a lawyer to explain not just how these apply in any given house case, how they apply to you as a foreigner, how they apply to someone in the country, how they apply to the value of the house in the future, right? A real being the most valuable, a lease being the least, and everything else being somewhere in between. And there's just so many situations. And of course, variations throughout the country are huge. Here in Leon, you're gonna have very different prices than up in the mountains in Matagalpa, and you're gonna have a very different cost here in the city than you would in a village by large margins, and what's available is gonna be wildly different. So at the end of the day, really coming down and visiting firsthand is pretty much required. And I say this as someone who bought a house sight unseen, so I am willing to be kind of risky myself. I am a bit hesitant to recommend being that risky to you as my audience. I have lived here previously. I had a team that I really trusted, and I had a lot of information at hand, so my ability to do that was pretty good. In general, you want to be here on the ground because it's not just, well, I like this town, I like this style house. You need to understand how it sits in the town, how the light hits it, how everything. And all those things are true other places, but the amount that they're true here is simply more. And it's hard to explain just how important that stuff is, but it is very, very large. And again, the variations in houses, from how they seal the roofs to the materials used to build to the style of the electric, everything, the dynamic range of variance is so large. The disparity between the cheapest house and the most expensive is many times larger than the disparity in the United States. You need to come and witness it firsthand and just have a feel for what's going to make you happy. I'm very confident that almost all of you who are interested in a house in Nicaragua can come and find something fantastic that you will fall in love with. But I recommend heavily, don't go through a real estate agent. Come down, find people on the ground that will help you, lawyers most importantly. You can have a real estate advisor. It's important that you think of them that way. It's a person who's going to help explain houses to you, someone who's going to help you go look at things, someone who's going to make the connections so you can visit a house or whatever. That can make sense. And if you think of a good real estate agent as simply being a real estate consultant, it's a bit different, because they're not exactly representing you, and if they understand that they are not making the deal, they are simply assisting you in the process, that will help. Because anyone who's working as an agent is going to have the expectation that they're going to be paid based off of a percentage of the deal, because they know that's what you're used to. So that is a set expectation, and then they have this huge incentive to manipulate that number to make it as big as possible. So that's how you need to not interact with a real estate agent. If you're going to hire someone to be a real estate advisor, make sure you're simply paying them to do that job, and then you can simply entrust them to the level that you're paying them to do, check in on them or whatever. You'll be able to tell more or less how helpful they're being. But if they're being a real estate agent, they can feel really, really helpful. They can, at the end of the day, seem like someone who helped you dramatically, and they may have cost you 50 to 100% more on your house without you ever realizing it. And due to the lack of comps, due to the lack of cross information between things, you may never find out that you were ripped off for unbelievable numbers. Nothing will ever tip you off unless you're spending a lot of time in real estate, and even then, you'll never be sure because there are no comps. So even if all of your neighbors' houses were half the cost of yours, you can't be confident that yours would have also been that price. That's why there's no system for verification, and there can't be. Accept it. Change how you think of real estate in this market, and you can do really, really well. It's going to take a little bit more effort, but that effort is going to be worth it. You can find such beautiful houses in so many styles. Here in Leon, I'm in Laborio, the oldest part of the city. We have lots of colonial structures, and if that's what you're looking for, this area would be perfect. We have a little bit different structure in Sutiaba to the west. If you go up to Fatima, you have modern construction with big, almost American-style houses, or perhaps Argentinian-style houses, which are completely different structure, completely different architecture. They have completely different driveways and sidewalks. Everything varies. Here, we have the city-style sidewalks. I'm going to turn around so you can see it, where the sidewalks go right up against the street, and the houses go right up against the sidewalks, and the houses all touch each other. But in Fatima, which is part of the same city, you have regular sidewalks like you'd have in the United States, with tree-lined walkways between them and the road, and the houses are separate from each other and sit back with yards in front. All in the same city, just different neighborhoods. If you go up into Democracia, it is the same kind of differences again, just the way that the houses sit on the road and how they interact with each other. So, and that's just within one city. Going around the country, you're gonna find these great variations that allow for you to find something really amazing. You have to see it firsthand. It's just part of the fun. And I think that's true in most countries. You're not gonna wanna just buy a house remotely. You're certainly not gonna just wanna look at listings online, because they're all there to sell something to you, and they're not gonna, really inform you of what it's like in the greater community. And that's the last thing I wanna talk about. One of the most difficult aspects of real estate here is not the actual structures themselves, but how they sit within the country. If you know the country extremely well, this may not be such a problem. But if you're in some place, again, like the United States or Canada, you can look at a map and have a pretty good idea of what a community is gonna be like an hour outside of Toronto, or 30 minutes outside of Dallas, or downtown Chicago. I don't need to go to all those places. Having grown up in the United States, I know exactly what I'm going to get in those different regions with only the tiniest of variation and confusion. I can really buy and sell remotely without too much problem. Show me some pictures of the house. I can go on Google Maps, get an idea of the community. I'm good. Here in Nicaragua, you can end up with crazy variations that you would never expect. I have seen people look at properties that seem like they're beautiful and oh, this has got to be great, modern construction, it's going to be really expensive, it's going to be luxury living. And what they don't show you is that they are hours from civilization. They're deep in the jungle. They're not connected by paved roads. They don't have power. They're running off of generators, and you have to have a 4x4 and some pretty skilled drivers and not have it during the rainy season, or you can't get to the house. I have a friend who has a house here. He can only access it for 6 months of the year. The other 6 months, he has to have all of his stuff stockpiled, or emergencies like come in by helicopter or a boat or something, because the water level rises. There's a lot of areas of the country that are deep jungle. You need to consider that you could easily end up looking at communities, because it's really popular for foreign investors to buy cheap land that's cheap because there's no road going to it, because the locals don't want anything to do with it. They buy it, put in a beautiful development, and then sell it to Americans and Canadians sight unseen. That's a bit of a problem. Then when you arrive, you're like, well, how am I supposed to get here? How am I supposed to get to a grocery store? How am I supposed to enjoy living here? Like, that's what, you didn't check it before you bought it, right? So there's a big market in selling that kind of stuff to foreigners who don't come and look at, and now maybe that's what you want. Maybe you want an isolated living situation, in which case there are some great options in Nicaragua that you're not gonna find in a lot of other places. That's awesome. Nicaragua offers a lot of variety, but that variety comes with risk if you're not aware that you may be getting a form of variety you were not planning on. So that's a big thing to consider, that, you know, some of these communities are very far afield. It's not like you're buying in a single city where you have a really good feel that, well, public transportation will take me in and out of the city center. That may not be the case. You may be looking at something very far away that doesn't even have accessible roads. I hope that was a lot of really useful information. I know that was very long and it kind of feels ranty, but the real estate situation here is complicated and very important to understand how you have to protect yourself, because so many foreigners are here preying on other foreigners because they think, they're convinced that the real estate agent will act like it does in North America, and so they present that illusion to them and take advantage of the fact that it's so hard to believe that it doesn't work that way. There's just so many assumptions built into our cultural experience that it makes us really easy pickings for someone looking to con us out of a good deal on a house. Thanks for joining me. Please ask your questions, like, subscribe, and I will see you next time.